All right, this week's kinesiology lab move of the week was the Fit Ball Rollout. All right, the Fit Ball Rollout, a kneeling Fit Ball Rollout. Most of us knew what this was. A good rollout and back up. All right, so we're going to break down the Fit Ball Rollout, specifically about what we've been talking about this week, using all of our kinesiology language as we discuss the scapular thoracic joint, the glenohumeral joint, and a little bit about the thoracic spine. All right, so why do we do the Fit Ball Rollout? We talked about this I like when Canadian physical therapist and author Stuart McGill, Dr. Stuart McGill, he talks about the rectus abdominis as being brakes for spinal extension. So what does that mean? Remember, especially a lot of us are sitting in this kyphotic position or this flexed position. This is spinal flexion, right? But what happens when we stand up? We want to stand up straight, but if we go too far, we got to put on the brakes and kind of maintain this neutral spine. So and we'll talk about athletically when this comes into play, but first for the Fit Ball Rollout, it's just all about putting on the brakes as we drop into this kind of falling plank. I fall forward, I need to put on the brakes right here, and then I come back up, all right? So back down, put on the brakes, and come back up. Not only am I slowing myself down, decelerating and putting on the brakes, as Dr. McGill says, but we're also taking advantage of our stretch reflex, our muscle spindles, kind of that rubber band plyometric effect, right? That as we go down, our rectus abdominis muscles, our hip flexors, our obliques are also going to stretch out and provides an opportunity for us then in that second to then kind of power ourselves back up with that stretch reflex again, okay? So think always about that. Every time you put a stretch on the muscle, what is that muscle length tension relationship, right? So that's what's happening in the rectus abdominis, mostly among the other muscles that we'll talk about at another time. So my Fit Ball Rollout, put on the brakes. If I don't put on the brakes, I fall into that lordosis. I fall into that lower back, spinal drop, right? I feel that in my lower back, not in a good way. And so we go down, tighten up, and come back up, all right? So Dr. McGill he's a specialist in lower back durability, lower back performance, athletic performance. So we bring him up from time to time in kinesiology lab, especially, all right? So why do we want to control spinal extension? Why do we want to slow down spinal extension? Well, athletically, so much of our power, okay, we talked about the shoulder girdle, shoulder joint. Dr. Kelly Starrett, CrossFit physical therapist, he talks about the shoulders being the secondary engine. Your hips are your primary engine. All your power comes from your hips, right? So my buddy James, right, at Brentwood Barbell, he's going to talk all about hip drive, right? Why do we want hip drive? All of our power comes from your ability to go from this flex position to drive through. And what happens is, if you're doing a squat, you're going to stand up and drive your hips through. You don't want to go further than this. You don't want to go there, right? That's all kinds of instability and motor control problems, especially if you're loaded with the weight here, or if you're standing with too much weight here, okay? So if we're doing a squat, a deadlift, a kettlebell swing, you're going to come through, drive your hips through, and boom, and hit that. Put on the brakes, your abs are tight, your spine just stays there. You don't want any sort of, let's say, sagittal plane, flexion, extension, pelvic tilting, excessive flexion, extension in the spine, energy leak going on as you're doing hip extension, okay? So that's weightlifting, right? That's kettlebell swinging and weightlifting. But let's say we're jumping. I'm a volleyball player. I'm a basketball player, right? I want to jump. When I go to jump, I drive my hips through, swing my arms through, and I want my hips to stop here, so all my force turns into vertical force, okay? If I go to jump and my hips come forward, that's an energy leak forward. That's a sagittal plane kind of energy leak there. I want all that going up. So I jump and drive, boom. That's all tight. I can go straight up. If I'm a golfer, I'm here. I bring the club back. The club is just sort of a whip, all right? It's at the end of my power. My power comes from my hips. My hips come, they drive through, good hip extension. When I hit full extension, my abs put on the brakes, stabilize my spine. Now I can whip through with my golf club. I can whip around with my baseball bat, okay? We talked about a couple of soccer players in lab today, that we plant this foot, my hip is flexed, in a unilateral fashion, I'm going to drive this hip through and then come through and kick, right? So I want to drive this hip, my abs have to control all of this going on, right? So we're not all kind of loosey-goosey there, okay? So plant, drive, and kick, okay? So spinal extension and controlling hip extension without going into an excessive spinal extension is so important. That's where the Fit Ball rollout comes into play. But the key, and why we brought this up this week, is that we're talking about the shoulder girdle. So the shoulder girdle is your shoulder blade sitting on your rib cage, right? Your scapula, rather, sitting on your rib cage. So if we don't have healthy upper back, shoulder blades, and shoulder joints, we can't do a Fit Ball rollout, right? That's the idea what we talked about in lab today. So if I do this rollout, think about what's going on in my shoulder joint, my scapular thoracic joint, and my T-spine. Those were the three areas that we look for when we're looking for compensation, okay? Because remember, this is an overhead movement. We look at volleyball players here and baseball players throwing here, and I'm grabbing a rebound in basketball. One of our patients, one of our clients might be picking up a grandchild, grabbing kitty litter off the top shelf, grabbing a coffee cup, it'd be empty, in the cabinet, right, reaching, semi-overhead. So we're looking at just shoulder health, and what does it look like when we reach overhead and do these different everyday moves? When we do a Fit Ball rollout, we're going into an everyday, or an overhead position, rather, an everyday overhead position, right? So we go into this overhead position and come back up. So again, great core exercise, but it requires the stability and control of your upper back. So again, where are we looking for compensation when we do anything overhead? We're looking at the thoracic spine, the thoracic area of the body, right? Your rib cage, your chest, your upper back. And when you go overhead, do we see any sort of sagittal plane compensation? All right, do we overextend? Can we not extend at all? We can't fully extend. Do we almost get the full extension, but then we have to elevate the rib cage in order to get full extension or get full overhead? All right, so the T-spine compensation, is anything going on there? Then your scapular humeral rhythm, and this is always the challenge because remember, those degrees of motion, that scapular humeral rhythm between your shoulder blade and your humerus is always different, whether you're abducting, whether you are diagonally abducting, whether you're doing kind of a D1, D2 sort of cross and chop and lift, whether you're doing a straight flexion move, that's going to change the way your scapula is moving with your humerus, right? So we're watching that, and are both shoulder blades working kind of bilaterally together as you go into that overhead position. We're watching for appropriate protraction, maybe a little bit of elevation, maybe a little bit of upward rotation as we go into this overhead position, because those are the movements, the joint actions at the scapulothoracic joint when you go into abduction and flexion, right? So I might get some protraction in order to stabilize my scapulothoracic joint. My serratus anterior is going to fire. I'm going to reach out into glenohumeral flexion. All right, I'm going to protract. I might elevate, upward rotate a bit, and then come back. All right, so all these motions need to occur. So is your scapulothoracic joint healthy and functioning appropriately? And bilaterally, right? Everyone's going to be a little different about where the shoulder blades go, but we kind of look at a unilateral difference. My left shoulder blade doesn't always behave. My left serratus anterior doesn't always behave. So I feel this difference when I go into something like a Fit Ball rollout. Finally, your glenohumeral joint, okay? Remember, your glenoid fossa, the socket that your shoulder joint, your humerus sits in, has to move with that, right? So as you go into this position, that scapula has to tilt. It's got to rotate, do all these things to where that socket stays lined up with your humerus as you go into that overhead position. Are you feeling any impingement? If you have someone do an overhead position like that, we've already done our impingement tests, right? Is anything stuck or compressed underneath that acromion process, underneath that coracoid ligament, underneath that coracoid arch, right? Made up of the ligament and the actual acromion process right here, right? When you go into that position. So maybe we've internally rotated and flexed the shoulder, diagonally, abducted, hand on the other side, we do that shoulder clearance test. So we've gone through all those moves to make sure that people can just get into this overhead position before we knock this out, okay? So again, great exercise, but don't have grandma do it, don't have your friend do it unless their shoulders are pretty healthy, okay? So the point then of all of this is that there's some great core exercises that we can do that we just call quote unquote core exercises, and we'll get into that in another lab and another video. But they are very dependent on a healthy shoulder blade, a healthy scapulothoracic joint, a healthy glenohumeral joint, a healthy T-spine, okay? So again, as a personal trainer, when someone comes in at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock at night, I have someone who comes in at 5:15 at night. They've been working at their desks all day long. I can't just jump right into a Fit Ball rollout. I want to work their core. I want to do these. Their shoulders are relatively healthy, but I just got to appreciate the fact that they've been sitting here all day long. What am I going to do to loosen them up? Am I going to do some hanging? Am I going to do some wall slides, some arm circles? What am I going to warm up? I want to hit their core, but we got to appreciate the entire kinetic chain, everything going on throughout the body. All right? So play around with these a little bit. The technique's always different. Remember, we had a few students kind of drop into this position. They weren't quite sure about their abs, so they like turning on their hips first. I like to do more of a lead with my belly button and falling plank technique. So I'm going to begin to flex my shoulders and then drop with my belly button, go down to my forehead or my nose, and then come back up. All right, so out and then back. All right, so if you're watching, you're not in class, and you're just looking for a good exercise, be aware of the types of things we're talking about if you've kept up with the language. But try a couple sets of 10 of those. It's a great core exercise, but just be mindful of the rest of your body. All right? I think that's about everything we covered in class today. Know that stuff. It's all good stuff. And I will see you next time.